Okay, well, oh, here's another person hopping on. So hopefully some more people will continue to hop on, but we'll go ahead and kind of get started. I want to thank everybody for hopping on this evening at 7 p.m. on your Thursday night. This is kind of a lecture to get us starting to think about preservation, and not just preservation at Montpelier, but preservation in general. You'll be hearing a lot from me next week, so I'd love to have another preservation professional come out and kind of talk about some of the research that has been done. Um, so our speaker tonight is a good friend of mine, Brannon Smithwick. She is a graduate from the University of Southern California with a dual master's degree in heritage conservation and urban planning. She now works as an architectural historian and preservation planner in the Los Angeles-based preservation firm Architectural Resource Group. Her research interests include examining the impacts of urbanism on intangible cultural heritage, specifically that of marginalized communities, as well as investigating how 21st century redevelopment efforts affect historic vernacular architecture at the local level. Brannon currently serves as a member of the Future Visions Committee for the Vernacular Architecture Forum, where she has presented research at the annual conference. She is actively involved in preservation action and the California Preservation Foundation, where she spoke on Rosenwald Schools at the 2023 conference. And I would love to thank you for coming out and spending your Thursday afternoon with us and talking to all the expeditioners and some of our staff members about Rosenwald Schools, which is a pretty significant architectural building and style that is important to the Black experience here in the Southeast. So it is important for us to kind of recognize these things and learn how to not only identify this type of structure, but ways that they can be preserved, and thinking about how their preservation efforts we could learn from and actually use here at Montpelier going into next week. So with no further ado, I will hand it over to Brannon for her presentation.
Thanks, Tessa. I appreciate it. Thanks for the bio. I'm really excited to be here. I visited Montpelier once a long time ago, and it seems like you guys are doing some really cool work there. And I can't wait to come back. And I'm really jealous of this program. I wanna, I wanna do it. Um, can you guys see my screen, Tessa? Okay. Um, Before I get started, I just want to give you a PSA. I'm sorry if you hear some scampering behind me. I just got a kitten this week and he is active. So if you hear some background noise, it's him being a terror. My name's Brannon. I just recently graduated from USC in Los Angeles this past spring. And my research for my thesis was focused on the Rosenwald Schools, specifically a case study Rosenwald School that's located in Tennessee, my home state. So I'll talk a bit about that, but I wanted to broaden the context to talk a little bit more about Rosenwald Schools in general for this presentation, because there are definitely quite a lot of Rosenwald Schools in Virginia and across the South. So this relates to the heritage that kind of stems from Montpelier as well. So just a little bit of an introduction. I became interested in Rosenwald Schools because of my own upbringing. I grew up in Mason, Tennessee, which is about 45 minutes outside of Memphis, Tennessee, in a house that my parents bought in 1992 that they quickly realized was actually a rehabilitated Rosenwald school. So here's photos of the house from 2011 and 1923. My mom found this photograph in the attic, and we had gotten to know some of our neighbors, all of which, or a lot of which, had attended school at this house that I was living in, that was called the Braden Thompson School, or later the Braden Sinai School. And so it was really interesting. My neighbors would walk by, they would tell us some stories about their history of going to school there, their memories. And my mom's a photographer and kind of just a creative storyteller in general. So she got the idea to do a kind of comprehensive public history project about the students who had gone to school there. So she took her large format camera and started documenting everyone she could get in touch with that went to school at this house that I was living in, and gathered all of their stories and really kind of created this feeling of place, and got into the idea of place-based memory. So she recorded about 40 oral oral histories and 40 photograph portraits that she then displayed on exhibit at the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis. So that was a really cool experience for her back in 2005. I was just a young girl at this point. But as I got older, I really began to appreciate this house that I was growing up in and this community that I had been submerged into, and the close-knit ties that they had, and kind of this feeling of gratefulness and excitement they had when they talked about Rosenwald Schools. So when I went back to grad school to focus on historic preservation and heritage conservation, I had the idea to kind of extend my mom's research and learn more about Rosenwald Schools in the South. It's a huge topic, so I zoned in on Tennessee specifically, but there's really a lot of work going on with Rosenwald Schools throughout the South. So I want to talk first a little bit about their historic context, because it's very layered and rich, and we only have time for a little bit of context, but I think it's important to kind of touch on that so you can understand how the Rosenwald Fund came about and why these schools were so important. So back in the days of the Civil War, as the Union was kind of taking over the South, started to liberate parts of the South, a lot of refugees who were formerly enslaved persons were fleeing all of these plantations. Lost my words. They're fleeing these plantations to go to these Union camps and in search of opportunities, in search of education, in search of employment, in search of passage to the North. And so all of these all these places in the Union Army were getting flooded, all of these camps that they had throughout the South with these refugees. And so Ulysses S. Grant saw this kind of need to create specific camps for these formerly enslaved persons, which he called contraband camps. So I'm sure many of you know that a lot of enslaved persons that had fled their plantations were called contraband at the time. And so Ulysses S. Grant and some of his officers created these camps scattered throughout the South for them to go to receive nutrition first and foremost, but also a place to stay and basic education until they could be rehoused elsewhere. The education that was kind of implemented was industrial training. So the men were learning things like field work, trades, and agriculture and tradesmanship. And the women were learning domestic work like sewing and cooking, which of course is completely crazy because they had been doing this type of work for decades, hundreds of years, while they were enslaved. So really what they needed were opportunities for upward mobility, liberal arts educations, but that was not available at the time. So that was the start of kind of Black education in the South. And as the war ended and the Reconstruction era took root, that kind of translated into the Freedmen's Schools. So the Freedmen's Bureau, it's a big topic, but it was basically a subsect of the Reconstruction era funding that was established to provide schooling for Black Southerners who had recently been freed from the Civil War. And so these guys had there were just a million, not a million, there were a lot of freedmen's schools across the South that popped up, thousands really. A lot of them are undocumented, their records are very scattered, but a lot of schools popped up across the South, and they were geared toward educating students who were in the elementary primary age. So early elementary age, you can see a photo here on the right of a freedmen's school. A lot of these schools were not year-round because Black Americans in the South, in the rural South, had kind of fallen into the sharecropping system, which was sort of a second institution of slavery after the war ended in many ways, but they weren't able to go to school full time. So these were kind of part-time schools, and the infrastructure wasn't there, the materials weren't there. A lot of the public funding was going toward white schools at the time. So, students often met in these log cabins, in Masonic lodges, sometimes in barns, and even just outside in yards and things, wherever they could congregate to get their education. And then the kind of public school laws kicked in the turn of the century. I won't get too much into it because this is pretty focused on Tennessee, but a lot of states, including Tennessee, established in the early years of the 20th century these separate segregated school systems. So one common school system or public school system now for Black students and one for white students. And of course, a lot of the funding was siloed illegally toward the white schools. So these freedmen schools remained underfunded, understaffed, and really fell into disrepair. A lot of students weren't getting the education they needed to get jobs. And so then that kind of prompted the need for private investment. So a lot of progressive era education philanthropies at the time, primarily kind of based out of the North. This was the progressive era. There was a lot of attention on public goods and public needs at the time, sanitation, education, access to those types of public goods. And so a lot of private investors saw the need for more investment in the South, especially with regard to education. And of course, this is kind of in that context of the mentality at the time, these wealthy white philanthropists thinking, oh, we need to invest in education because it will, quote, civilize these people who are now, freed persons. So obviously that has its own racial underlying, context to it. But it did create opportunities for education philanthropies to invest in Southern education. And so there were a lot of different philanthropies that sprung up with different focuses, primarily on providing school materials and teacher training education, but more importantly, kind of creating opportunities for teachers and schools to pop up. But one kind of was set apart from the rest, and that was the Rosenwald Fund. While these other philanthropies really focused on kind of the intangible aspects of schools, like teacher salaries, teacher training materials, the Rosenwald Fund really sought or saw the need for physical school infrastructure, actual built environment architecture that would create opportunities for students to come and learn. And so it was a collaboration between Julius Rosenwald, who's here, and Booker T. Washington. Julius Rosenwald was a philanthropist based out of Chicago. He was the CEO and one of the founders of Sears and Roebuck Company, which I miss so much. I loved going to Sears as a kid. And then also Booker T. Washington, who obviously was a very prolific Black author and educator who founded the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama at the time. So these two met through mutual acquaintances and decided that there was a real lack of investment in physical infrastructure for schools in the South. So they decided to create that opportunity, and they started in 1913 with a pilot program of just 6 schools built kind of in the general vicinity of Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. So the program was to be run by the Tuskegee Institute and funded with monies invested from Julius Rosenwald Foundation, which he was starting around this time with the monies that he had made from investing and from his own business adventures. So the Tuskegee era was kind of the first era of 2 eras of the Rosenwald Fund. And the first thing they did was kind of create this pamphlet of design guidelines and kind of philosophical guidelines for the Rosenwald Fund. And so that was kind of spearheaded by Robert Robinson Taylor, here to the right, who was an architect. He was trained at MIT and he headed the architecture department at Tuskegee. So he doesn't receive enough credit for the Rosenwald Fund. So I like to throw him in there because he is largely responsible for the first Rosenwald plans in the years kind of between 1913 and 1920. So the Tuskegee Institute put this pamphlet together and published it in 1915, and it was called The Rural School Building and Its Relationship to the Community. And so in that, there was information about the Rosenwald philosophy, which was unique from other kind of philanthropies that were emerging at the time, in that it really promoted this ethos of, quote, self-help. So both Washington and Julius Rosenwald were very interested in the idea of contributing to your own success. And so for that reason, they established the Rosenwald Fund School Building Program as a grant program. Based on need, but more primarily based on ability to match the funding. So if a community, a Black community in the rural South, wanted to build a Rosenwald school, they would have to petition the Rosenwald Fund for the money by proving that they had enough people who could contribute to match that fund and who could actually complete the labor of building the school. So this was one way to get communities engaged and active and interested in Rosenwald schools, but also kind of, again, contextual for the time in that these newly freed Americans and citizens now were paying taxes on public schools to be able to receive materials and funding, and yet here they were having to pay out of pocket to build the schools. So essentially, these communities were being taxed twice, and were already, very poor communities, sharecropping communities who couldn't really afford education in the first place. But so many communities made it happen, and it was with these standards that they were able to do so. And so they created this pamphlet, and it had design schemes in it. It had all sorts of lumber and materials. You can see it was so specific about what they were allowing within the program. It also had information about social kind of community-oriented events that could happen with Rosenwald buildings, how to partition rooms, how to landscape the building. So it was very specific as far as what the vision was for these early Rosenwald schools. And so here's some examples of them. The excerpt, the pamphlet that was published, it did have plans from one-room schoolhouses all the way up to county training schools, which I'll talk about later, which were meant to be multiple building, kind of campus-wide schools. But in the early days, really, it was just these 1, 2, maybe 3 teacher schoolrooms that were being built. Again, these communities couldn't afford much more at the time. Students had to come work in the field, so they weren't really getting an education past 8th grade. So it was very small, like kind of 1 to 3 schoolhouses that were popping up all over the South, primarily at this time in the Deep South. So in Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia predominantly, and Louisiana as well. And so this is kind of an idea of what they looked like. They were typically wood clapboard siding with double hung 9/9 light windows, gabled or hipped roofs, typically on wood or brick foundations to let air ventilation through. The pamphlet was very specific about orientation and site and setting in order to get the best east and west light and ventilation. So it was very architecturally advanced for the time. And eventually these schools kind of became the model typology for rural schools, both in and out of the Rosenwald funding at the time. And so here's some examples. You can see on the left, there's some community members building what looks to be a one-room schoolhouse. And then on the right, here's one in Virginia that looks like it was probably a 2-room schoolhouse. But again, you can see some of these Rosenwald features. This one on the right has been rehabilitated. You can tell by the modern windows, but they tried to emulate that kind of 9/9 light window. It's got the gabled roof. So this is kind of what you would see with a Rosenwald building from the era of 1919 to 1920. And then in 1920, the Rosenwald Fund kind of reorganized and moved to Nashville. So by this point, about 600 schoolhouses had been built throughout the South, in the Deep South again specifically. And it was at this point that the program really blew up. Because it was building so quickly and kind of just expanding really quickly, the folks at Tuskegee weren't really able to keep up with the administrative side of it. And so Julius Rosenwald established a whole office in Nashville geared specifically toward running the school building program for the Rosenwald Fund. So this was, on the one side, a good thing because the program was expanding. Local communities were interested in building schools, but on the other side, the downside was that they were taking this program out of the hands of Black educators and putting it into the hands of white philanthropists. So that, of course, has an impact on the ethos of the program. But it did allow for more opportunities for schools to be built. And so starting around 1920, they started publishing the Community School Plans program, building bulletins. And so those were happening pretty much every year with updated typologies, updated requirements for funding, and just kind of updates every year. And these were passed out for free all the way through communities in the South. So this is when the Rosenwald Fund school building program, like I said, really took off and expanded westward into Texas and Arkansas, and eastward into the Carolinas, Virginia, and as far north as Maryland. So the focus here also shifted from 1 to 3 room schoolhouses architecturally to thinking about larger county training school campus plants. So the hope here was to extend education opportunities all the way through high school and to continue with the industrial and primary education training, but also to bring in opportunities for liberal arts training and college prep. So this was like way ahead of its time in the 1920s. Again, a lot of funding at the public level was being siphoned to white public schools. And so these were full-on campuses that Black communities were funding themselves. So you can see on the right here some more advanced photographs of some of these buildings that were still in the Rosenwald typology, but maybe using more modern materials like brick. And so again, another example here, the New Road School in Louisiana, which used a Rosenwald kind of H-shaped plan for the community school and continued to build throughout the 30s and 40s and even 50s. And so by 1932, there were over 5,000 Rosenwald schools throughout the South. And this is the year that the school building program ended. Rosenwald said, okay, we've created a network of schools. It's time to kind of toward other things like curriculum and materials and things like that. So it was still, they were still invested in Black education in the 30s, but they had shifted away from building infrastructure. So you can see there's a lot of concentrations of Rosenwald schools in these more rural areas, definitely lots in Tennessee, in Mississippi, and over in Virginia and Maryland as well. And so I just want to talk about the case study that I studied when I was doing my research. It was called the Hardeman County Training School from 1920 to 1928, and later became the Allen White School. It was renamed in 1928 when the school got a new principal and kind of changed its ethos about the direction they wanted to go. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the history of the school and give you some examples of the architecture because it's reminiscent of the Rosenwald program. So Whiteville, Tennessee is located about 45 minutes northeast of Memphis in Whiteville, which is in Hardeman County. You can see this old map. I don't think it's a Sanborn map, but it's similar, an old planning map. It's in the northwest corner of Hardeman County, and Bolivar is the seat of the county there. And then Grand Junction is somewhere down here. Yeah, right here. And that's where the first contraband camp was during the Civil War. So this is only about 20 minutes south of where, or excuse me, north of where those enslaved persons were coming for this area to receive aid from the Union Army. And so because of that, partially because of that, Whiteville kind of settled as a pretty mixed race community. It was about 60% Black and 40% white. It became a big export of cotton for the big city of Memphis nearby, and other goods and kind of agricultural goods like corn and fruits were grown here as well. But by 1920, there were quite a few Black-owned businesses in town. There were 2 lawyers, there was a jeweler, there were lots of farmers who were Black. So there was some opportunity for wealth happening here for the Black community. And there was a small school that was started in 1905 for Black students, a primary school. And it was, in its first few years, it was only about 20 to 30 students. And then by 1910, it had grown to 200 students. And so that school was founded by this guy right here, Jesse C. Allen, who kind of petitioned Black leaders in town for a larger campus. He said, we can't keep operating out of this Masonic lodge with 200 students that actually had been burned at one point from unknown causes. It's speculated that it was likely an arson attack. So, they really needed funding and more infrastructure to expand this need for education as Black residents were starting to establish themselves in Whiteville. So a group of kind of trustees came together. They're all here on the wall of the building. To petition the Rosenwald Fund to buy property and to create a county training school. Their hope was to build a Rosenwald building and then to expand from there with Rosenwald funding and with investment from other philanthropic organizations. So there's the original deed. They got what they needed in 1920, and they were able to build the first Rosenwald school in Hardeman County, and it was called Doris Hall originally. And this was the first building on the campus of the Hardeman County Training School. So here's a Sanborn. You can see where it was sited, right off of Jackson Road in Whiteville. And this was actually documented as the first brick Rosenwald building in the state of Tennessee, and might possibly be the first one in the whole Rosenwald School building program. The photos I showed you earlier were from later buildings. So this could possibly be the first typology using brick building, which is really interesting. They used the 6A plan from the community school plans. This is the 1921 pamphlet, but there was a couple of them earlier. So this was one of the first 6A plans implemented as well. And they used brick. They have those double hung windows, the gables, and hipped roof. So this was a really, really huge advancement for the community at the time to be able to provide classrooms for these students to come and learn. But the school had a really hard time. The community built the school and they said, great, we've done it. We're done. But they didn't take into consideration operating costs and continued building maintenance. And so the school community kind of fell into financial burden. They faced some issues with the financing of the school over the course of the next decade. And unfortunately, Jesse C. Allen, who was the original principal, passed away. So they were kind of scrounging together pennies trying to keep the school operating as it grew. And then in 1928, James H. White came in to take over the school. He had been educated in Nashville and also partially at Columbia, where he got his master's in education in New York. So he had seen what it means to create education opportunities both in the North and the South for Black students. So he came in and really hit the ground running with fundraising. Their first kind of agenda item was to rename the school, and they renamed it the Allen White School after the founder and their new principal, who was going to guide them into this new era of building infrastructure for their county training school. So in 1929, just 1 year after he came to the school, they were able to burn the mortgage at a mortgage burning ceremony because they had paid off all their debts on Doris Hall. So the school was then able to continue fundraising for new buildings on campus, and that's where it really blew up in the next couple decades. So I'll just talk a little bit about how the school progressed both architecturally and curriculum wise. This was also, getting into the Depression years, so money was tight. And New Deal funding was kind of distributed across all of these schools in the South. Both white and Black schools established National Youth Administration programs, NYA programs, and the Allen White was chosen as one of the only Black county training schools to receive this funding. And that was in part due to a collaboration with John D. Rockefeller, who started the General Education Board. So he was involved. Eleanor Roosevelt helped petition for this school. So it had become a pretty prolific school by this point to gain funding for expansion. And it was all done with students. Students built the school, students ran the school. They were building, they were learning the trades. So they were learning how to construct buildings. They were learning how to maintain buildings. They were learning masonry. And the women were learning how to cook and clean. So they ran the cafeteria, they ran the dormitories, and it really blew up during this period to become a whole campus for industrial, but also liberal arts training as well. So just a few buildings on campus. There was Howells Hall, which was also a Rosenwald typology, and it operated as a science room, but also there was an agriculture classroom in there and a storage shed where they would keep some of their equipment for agricultural field work. There was Ingram Hall, which was a girls' dormitory and teachers' dormitory. But in the 1930s, the school, like I said, really blew up, and they needed dormitories for students to come and live there who lived in other parts of the state of Tennessee and even other parts of the South. So students lived and worked here. Again, similar to a Rosenwald typology. I'm pretty sure this was published in their annual newsletter that the students ran, and I'm pretty sure they took these renderings directly from the Rosenwald pamphlets. So it was very similar to what was being published and what was being built across the South. The principal's home, which has some craftsman influence, which was emerging at the time. This is where James H. White lived with his family during his tenure at the school. the Sandwich Shop and the Clift Recreational Hall. Here's Clift Recreational Hall. This became kind of a focal point on campus for all sorts of social activities. A gymnasium was built in there. There was an auditorium. And so this is where students would congregate for indoor recreational activities during recess, etc. The Sandwich Shop, which is here, was like a shotgun style building. That was a little sandwich shop on campus where students could come and grab lunch, especially those working in the field. It was also open to the public as a means of fundraising for the school. And then the campus landscape and grounds. This was a rural area. This was a largely industrial and agricultural training. So a lot of the students spent time outside for their classroom experience. And then it also offered a lot of outdoor recreational opportunities too. So students could go outside and play, run around the grounds, and a lot of hardscaping was put in as well. So this really became like a whole campus that was kind of indicative of what was going on at Tuskegee. That mentality of, self-motivation, building your own, creating your own opportunities permeated throughout the Allen White School mentality. And so they had social events here. This was their graduation in 1938. Hardscaping, I said, had been put in, so it really felt like a cohesive campus. Here's the original 1920 Doris Hall building, flanked by Howells Hall and Ingram Hall, as well as some other buildings in the back. I'm not exactly sure which buildings are where, but I'm pretty sure that this is the recreational hall back there as well. And then kind of by the late 1930s, they recognized the need for a bigger high school building. By this point, Doris Hall was kind of overrun with students and couldn't hold the capacity in the classroom space. And so they were able to get funding again from the Rosenwald Fund, but also from some private investment in Tennessee. John Cheek, who the building was named after, invested in this building for a high school. And this was to kind of provide more liberal arts education for high school age students. But in 1941, the building was burned only a few days before they had received their final installment of payment to complete it. And again, unknown reasons why, but by this point, the Allen White School had gotten so much press and attention and brought a lot of attention to Whiteville for this amazing, Black County training school that they were building, that there was a lot of resentment from the white community. And so a lot of speculation leads to the fact that this was likely burned by arson in 1940 with the construction materials inside. So this Cheek Hall never existed. Luckily, we do have some construction photos, but it never came to fruition. But that didn't deter Principal White and his community. They immediately started fundraising again. In fact, there's correspondence from the very next day of them ordering brick materials to build bricks and create the foundation of the masonry for a new Cheek Hall the very next day. So it goes to show you the determination of these Rosenwald communities to create infrastructure for their students. And so then 8 years later, in 1948, they had completed the second Cheek Hall. It ended up being an entirely brick building. This is not a Rosenwald floor plan. It does have elements, but it does lean kind of more toward the urban institutional school typology that was starting to emerge after the war. The NYA was no longer on campus. That ended during the war years. So this was kind of a more modern, large school building with a cafeteria, an auditorium, and this all came to fruition through extensive fundraising campaigns. Principal White, both in the Whiteville community, but also bringing in investment from people in the North, from philanthropists, from other, Tennessee wealthy philanthropists, etc. And so this is what the campus looked like between 1930 to 1950, roughly around 1950. You can see there's the original Doris Hall building that was built in the 20s. There's all of these buildings that were built in the 1930s with the NYA funding. And then there's the Cheek Hall building, which was completed in the late 1940s. And there was a lot of, surrounding landscape for agricultural fields, recreation, where students would spend their time outside for recreation and for classwork. And then in the civil rights era, the school really kind of shifted more toward blue collar business opportunities. It was less about building and more about creating more education opportunities for graduates and for students who wanted to go on to college. So they implemented typing classes. They had driving classes for men who wanted to become bus drivers or porters. Again, obviously, we know that the types of jobs that Black Americans could get at this time were limited, but the Allen White School was doing everything it could to prepare its students for the modern real world. So these are excerpts from their yearbooks. You can see, interiors of the gymnasium, the classrooms. It was, by all means, a modern school system. And just to note, their basketball teams won the national championships like multiple years in a row. They were very prolific for their sports at Allen White, which the community loved to talk about. And then in 1964, the last building that was built on campus was an elementary school building. This is not a Rosenwald typology, but it is kind of indicative of that modern institutional, mid-century modern school building typology, I'd say. So they kind of took all of the classrooms out of Doris Hall because that building was over 40 years old at this point and falling kind of, behind on maintenance work. And so they moved it into the elementary school building and they used Doris Hall as an administrative building. So it still had that Rosenwald root, but it had extended beyond that by the civil rights era. And then the school went into the integration period. So in the 1950s, obviously Brown versus Board of Education overruled the separation of schools, and they were integrated in Hardeman County in 1964. But it wasn't until 1973 that the Allen White School actually closed and those students integrated into the surrounding white schools. So this was, a huge blow to the community who had worked so hard to build this school. It was probably the best school infrastructure in Hardeman County. So there was a lot of movement to actually move white students to the Allen White School. But of course, this is rural Tennessee. That wasn't going to fly. So they shut down the school and it fell into a state of disrepair for the next 40 years or so. And then in 1971, just 1 year after, right around the time the school closed, someone intentionally burned down Cheek Hall, the building that they had worked so hard to build and then rebuild. So this was the fourth, arson attack, presumably, that this one Rosenwald community experienced. So this is what Allen White looks like today. Doris Hall is still there. Luckily, the 1920s building was not burned down, and the elementary school building is still there too. So you can see how much this campus has shrunk since then, both through demolition and through arson. So it's a much smaller campus presence footprint today. And so just want to talk briefly about their conservation efforts and how those lead into the conservation efforts representative of Rosenwald communities in general. So again, this school kind of fell into disrepair for the next 30 or 40 years. It was being used, Doris Hall and the elementary school building were being used for some local businesses. They would have charity events in there, et cetera, but no one was maintaining the school. The public school system was not operating these buildings anymore. They were just kind of left abandoned until the early 2000s when a group of alumni came together and formed an alumni association that purchased the land on which the building sat and had it evaluated for National Register nomination, which is really cool. I'm so glad they did this. So the building was decided to be significant for its association with the Black community and for its architecture, being the first brick Rosenwald building in the state of Tennessee at the time. And even though it doesn't have the most integrity, as you can see by this photo, which was taken in 2005, it still was deemed significant, especially since a lot of the integrity could be redeemed with rehabilitation work. But in 2012, another arson attack, it's just shocking how much this community's been through. Someone in 2012 randomly burned down the building, or perhaps not randomly, but they left the elementary school building, but they burned the original Cheek Hall. And so, the original Doris Hall. And so we see that, some of the walls remain, the foundation remains, but at this point it's become honestly an overgrown ruin, and there hasn't been much movement with the community to raise funding to be able to rehabilitate this structure. And again, the elementary school is still there, but it has also fallen into disrepair due to deferred maintenance. So the hope for the community organization, which is called ECHO, the El Canaan Community Hope Organization, which is affiliated with a church in where a lot of graduates from the Allen White School attend in Whiteville. And their hope is to rehabilitate the school, or excuse me, reconstruct the school now into a community center. So they're hoping to be able to reconstruct it into a community center that offers vocational training, a school for young kids, a kindergarten, and a museum portion. But this is kind of an ongoing conversation. I had lots of conversations with the community about potentially preserving the site as a ruin to shed light on the layers of violence that, have plagued this campus for years, potentially rehabilitating the elementary school, which has great bones, into a vocational center, potentially even building a new building to shed light on these layers of history. So it's an ongoing conversation. They've received about $100,000 in grant funding from the state of Tennessee over the last 8 or 9 years, but of course it's an ongoing fundraising effort, as is the case with so many Rosenwald schools throughout the South. So just talking a little bit more broadly about how we should be conserving Rosenwald schools as emerging professionals. I know a lot of you are going into field work this week with Tessa and thinking about how to conserve these buildings. And it's really important to think about how we can take that knowledge that we have and bring it out into the community, especially under-recognized and underserved communities who are in need of heritage professionals to assist, but not necessarily to, take over and lead these types of projects for them. So the most important thing we can be doing is documenting the architecture that does exist. So just like you guys are going to be doing this week, field documentation is second to none when it comes to conservation efforts. I would argue that they should be done at the HABS level, which is the Historic American Building Survey, which I'm sure many of you are aware of. It's housed in the Library of Congress. Here is one Rosenwald school that was that had HABS documentation done, I think, back in the 30s. So this is something that's really important to do to get an idea of this building typology and the different types of buildings that are still extant. Doing materials testing, structural testing, archaeological excavation, which I know Montpelier is doing so much of, which is really great, and SOI standards interventions where they can be done: preservation, rehabilitation, restoration, and reconstruction, and starting to think about different ways that we can conserve the built fabric of the Rosenwald schools that remain. But then in my thesis, I make the argument that we must be including intangible heritage. In fact, I think it's more important than the architecture. And I know that's kind of a contentious thought, but at the end of the day, it's about the building, but it's about what happened in these buildings and the school community and the social events that happened here that uplifted Black Americans at a time when they were so marginalized. And so it's important to think beyond these physical resources and to expand the authorized heritage discourse, a phrase coined by Laura Jane Smith in her book, which is really good. I highly suggest you read it, to avoid kind of othering these histories. How can we be expanding our dialogue about how to preserve buildings and how to conserve heritage without othering under-recognized communities. So it's important for us as professionals to offer guidance, but to step back and allow these communities to take control. So there are lots of ways for me that as a professional heritage person that I would consider, the best way to preserve the Allen White School. But they have their ideas about how they want it done, and that's their choice and their community and their ability to make that happen. I can only provide my assistance and my input to help them achieve that goal. And one way to do this is to broaden the toolkit, and that includes things like qualitative methods and digital methods, which I'll talk a little bit about in the next slides. Qualitative methods, oral history is one of my favorite tools. I guess I got that from my mom. I had the opportunity to interview a few Rosenwald students for my thesis. These were some photographs my mom took and some students that she had interviewed. Luckily, she was able to interview some of the earlier students who had been there in the 30s and 40s. Most of the students that I interviewed had been there in the 50s and 60s because they're now an aging population. This is Friedel Harris. She interviewed him back in 2004, and I interviewed him now in 2020, and he's still fighting for the Allen White cause. Yeah, and I got to meet Evelyn Robertson, who was really helpful. He's spearheading this whole movement. I did a 6-hour long interview with him, and we talked about the ephemera collection that he has, which really helped me glean a lot of information about what was going on at the Allen White School during its heyday. And then mental mapping, I think, is super important. Another way to kind of get an idea of the heritage. These were given to me by a former student, and it really helped me understand what was happening in what spaces and how the architecture was interplaying with the intangible community and the social events and what was going on campus. So these were really beneficial when it came to understanding the space and how people flowed through these spaces. And then I had these students make their own mental maps. Kevin Lynch is a kind of notable urban planner that really advocates for cognitive mapping. And so that was something that I tried to implement in my studies, having everyone that I interviewed draw a map of what they remember the Allen White campus to be. So I drew Doris Hall and then the church that they have there, as well as landmarks, and then asked them to draw what buildings they remember around it. So that really helped me get a sense of what buildings were where, when they might have been demolished, what was happening in each building, etc. So this was a cool experiment that I had the students do. And then obviously digital methods. I have to give a shout out to Virginia because you guys are probably doing the best of all the states that are conserving Rosenwald schools. I think story maps are a great way to just engage with the public when it comes to heritage. I know you guys have a few for Montpelier. And so this is kind of a great starting point to be able to include digital media, photography, written text to tell the story of these places. So here's just a little kind of excerpt video of what's going on in Virginia. So if you're ever looking for a Rosenwald school, the state of Virginia under Preservation Virginia started an archaeological survey of all of the Rosenwald schools in 2013. It's ongoing, but you can see that they've collected data on the schools. And there's, you can type schools in, you can find certain schools, and they have attachments for photographs and things like that. So if you're ever looking for a Rosenwald school, this is the way to do it in Virginia. And I'm really hoping that more states will implement this type of GIS work to be able to catalog the Rosenwald schools. And then, of course, Tessa knows this model well. I got to talk to her for my thesis and include some of her knowledge about GIS work and building information modeling. This is a great way to digitally reconstruct schools, especially those that maybe are no longer there, to get a better sense of what happened there using oral histories and using photographs, etc., to reconstruct that history digitally. And then my favorite, what's already happening with the Rosenwald schools is kind of happening out of Auburn University. There's a professor there, Gorham Bird, who every semester maps a new Rosenwald school with his students as a part of a classroom course that he teaches there. So here's a rendering from some LiDAR scanning that they did of the New Hope School in Alabama. And then they've put that into Matterport software to kind of give you the opportunity to virtually experience this school. So you can literally drop into the school, click around, see what it looks like, click on this supplemental information that shows you photographs, videos, etc. So this is another great way, in addition to story maps and building models, to get a sense of what these places looked like when they're potentially no longer there or in good shape. And so yeah, my findings and takeaways. Obviously, this is a really important school. The Allen White School was really important for this community. It put Whiteville on the map as far as education goes. It created so many opportunities. Looking at the data of graduates, many went on to become lawyers, doctors, a lot of those who continue to work in agriculture and trades had the opportunity and the business acumen to own their own businesses, which really contributed to the economic growth of Whiteville. And this is the case for so many communities across the South. Congressman John Lewis went to a Rosenwald school. Maya Angelou went to a Rosenwald school, and many others. So these really have a legacy across the South that are worth preserving. And the buildings are not in great condition. So there are quite a few that have been rehabilitated, but of the 5,000, we're down to about 400 extant buildings, a lot of which have fallen into disrepair or are no longer, structurally sound. So now is the time. Luckily, they've been put on the endangered places list for the National Trust. And there's more grant funding coming out in the last few years for Black Americans through the National Trust to conserve these spaces. There was a Rosenwald Studies Act that was just passed with the National Park Service a couple years ago, so they're starting to survey some of these buildings. But I would argue that it's not a comprehensive approach. We need to think about these buildings less as localized, preservation efforts and more as one cohesive fabric of the built environment that extends across the South that is in dire need of preservation assistance. So there's my resources, just a few. And thank you. I know that's a lot of information in 45 minutes, but I was trying to get as much in as I possibly could, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you guys might have.
Yeah, it looked like we had one pop up in the chat about where did the land that Rosenwald Schools were built on, where did that come from? Was it being donated? Was it community members letting them build on their land?
Yeah, totally. So it was kind of a mix of a lot of different things, but it was typically either Black landowners who would donate plots of land, or a lot of times it wasn't the case in Hardeman County, but in a lot of communities there's actually a lot of white support for Rosenwald Schools, and so a lot of times white landowners would donate some land as well, or sell it to a Rosenwald community that was emerging for a dime. So there were a lot of instances of collaboration between white and Black communities, which I think is really of note. But yeah, in the case of the Allen White School, it was a local farmer who was part of this kind of organizing body, who had kids that were going to this small school. And so he donated, I think, 3 acres of one of his farms to the cause. So yes, that was typically the case. Based on my research, I haven't found any public school lands that were put toward this, but I'm sure that was also the case in some rural areas that were actually siphoning a little bit of money toward Black education.
If anybody else has any questions, go ahead and raise your hand. I did have a question. So you talked earlier in the presentation about how a lot of these plans were kind of published in pamphlets. Were the materials sold like kits, kind of like Sears was doing, or were they given the instructions and then going and getting the materials themselves?
That's a really good question. So that was a conversation between Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington, and it was kind of one, if you look at the correspondence, it was kind of a contentious, kind of tiptoey conversation, because Julius Rosenwald wanted to create kit housing. I mean, kit schools. This was the time of kit housing back in the early 20th century, and he saw it as kind of a business opportunity, not necessarily to sell it, but to donate and just kind of create marketing and public knowledge of these kits that they were doing at Sears. But Booker T. Washington was really adamant about not doing that, because he really wanted these Black community members to physically do the labor to build these schools themselves. Again, that Booker T. Washington is kind of contentious in his mentality for education, for his approach, I'd say. There was a lot of argument between him and W.E.B. Du Bois, who felt differently about how we should be approaching Black education. But for Booker T. Washington, it was very much about, this is our school, we have to build it, we have to make it happen. And so he kind of tiptoed around that by saying, hey, I really think we should do it this way. And luckily, to his credit, Julius Rosenwald was super receptive to that and said, yes, this is not for me. This is for, the Black Southerners. And so we have to do it the way that you want to do it. So, yeah.
And Patricia had a question in here. Is there a list of Rosenwald schools on the National Trust's website?
Good question. So there's a list of selected schools across the South. If you Google, I don't have a link right here, but if you Google National Trust Rosenwald Schools, they have kind of, it's not a story map, but it's a good article with examples. But there's not a comprehensive list, which is part of the problem. So it's a very, like I said, a very fragmented approach. Virginia probably has the most comprehensive list. Tennessee is starting to do it. Alabama is starting to do it, but other states like Louisiana hasn't done much. Maryland, the Carolinas haven't done much. So I'm really hoping that future investment will kind of standardize that process and make it a little bit easier to do it. I mean, I hate to say a top-down approach because that's not, it should always, in my opinion, start from the community and work upward. But I do think as far as documentation goes, a top-down approach could be really, really beneficial.
So you talk about how the house you grew up in was a like adaptive reuse, Rosenwald School. What are some other examples of how Rosenwald schools have been adaptively reused?
Yeah, so I think that's a good question. A lot of them, like I said, were in disrepair but had good enough bones to rehabilitate, and a lot of them have kind of stuck to that same education kind of ethos, or I don't want to say ethos, but education typology, building usage rather. So yeah, a lot of them are preschools, a lot of them are community centers that have like after school programs for, communities that are still largely underinvested in, that we know. So I think it's really interesting how they kind of stuck to that same usage throughout the years. Some of them are museums as well, like local communities will often rehabilitate and then put together their collections of ephemera and display it there, which I think is really interesting. But I do think that in these cases of county training schools where there were multiple buildings, there's really an opportunity to tell a greater story. It's not just about that one building. It can also be about what was happening during this time frame in the community, in the Rosenwald School building program. So I'm hoping that the Allen White community will recognize that and move in that direction to rehabilitate and possibly reconstruct or even preserve. There hasn't been a lot of ruin preservation. There's a lot of cool stuff like that happening just in other, like I'm sure you've seen, Tessa, there's some barns and things and old plantation homes that have been rehabilitated with like glass and all sorts of cool stuff. I think that could be a really interesting opportunity for the Allen White School. There's this argument for preserving places at sites of conscience where there have been violence, usually affiliated with wars. But I think that the Allen White School has, there's been 4 arson attacks on campus, and that's what's left of their campus. And so I think a really strong visual representation could be made by incorporating glass into the ruin that they have there right now, and then telling the story in an additional building. So there's a million ways you could do it, but I'd say most of them have been rehabilitated into these like preschools and museums and local community centers.
Well, it's good to hear that a lot of them are still getting some use, and not all of them are falling into disrepair. Anybody else have any questions? I got one more question. So were these schools for both male and female children?
Yeah, so they were, and so even by the end, it was, by the end of the school building program, most of the schools were still just primary schools. The county training schools did become more popular, but there were very few cases like Allen White that really grew to be a whole campus plant. So it was mostly for elementary school age kids, first through 8th grade, primary education. And so they would do primary education, so basic math, arithmetic, English, science, the classic primary education, reading, but then they would supplement that with industrial training. So a lot of times these 1 to 3 room schoolhouses would have one room where all of the students would in the morning meet and have their primary education. Then they would have lunch. And then in the afternoon, they would split into the two other rooms or the boys would go outside and work in the fields and the girls would, learn cooking and domestic work. So it was very much centered on these stereotypical kind of opportunities that Black Americans had for hundreds of years in the States. And then later, when the school buildings grew and they incorporated more high school curriculum, that's when they started teaching classes like typing, driving, business, etc.
Okay, cool. Well, it's like thinking about what you were talking about with intangible heritage and digital means for conserving buildings are all kind of things that we're going to start kind of touching on next week during our expedition. So this was a great little kind of introduction into that. We are working to get some descendants that either worked or lived in the buildings we're documenting next week out to tell us some oral history and really walk us through these buildings and tell us like what rooms were what, why they were either living there or working there. So getting those stories really adds like this whole nother layer of understanding to a structure because I mean, if you're not living in the structure, you don't know all the things. You don't know like what creaks in the middle of the night or like which stair, is the loosest or, what the morning feels like in a house. So it's those things that we really get from the people who lived and grew and experienced these structures.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so you all are going to be helping me document these buildings, doing measured drawings, and then your field notes, I'm going to take those and use them to create CAD drawings, and then create 3D models of these structures to add into that main house model that Brandon showed a little sneak peek of. So it's really working to not only document but preserve what these houses look and make it accessible for the public, not just us here at Montpelier, not just preservation professionals, but everybody can log on and look at these buildings and go through the history and look through all the photos, all the historic photos. Thank you so much, Brannon, for this presentation. It was great. I've learned so much. I hope everybody else here learned a lot about Rosenwald Schools. I'm so interested to look at some of these maps and really maybe take a closer look at some buildings on property and think about like, could this have been a Rosenwald School that's been adapted into something else? That's something that I am very interested in looking at across property or just in the surrounding area around Montpelier, that there might be a Rosenwald School out there that nobody's identified as a Rosenwald School.
Yeah, it's highly possible. There's a lot in Virginia, so I definitely encourage you locals to check it out and see what you can do. And that's really cool that you guys are doing that next week. I can't wait to see what becomes of that. That's a really awesome opportunity. I'm jealous.
Yeah. Well, if nobody else has any questions, I think we will wrap up for the evening. But again, thank you so much for tuning in. If you have any questions, reach out to me. I recorded this lecture, so I will try and get the link out sometime tomorrow in case you want to rewatch it or share it with somebody about this great information that you learned. Okay. Well,
Thanks, Tessa.
yeah, thank you. Have a good night, everybody. Bye.